Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So this is the Conservative case against Winston Churchill continued, because it went on for an hour and a quarter last night, and there's only so much a person can digest. But I feel fatigue going on for such an exceptionally lengthy time. Anyway, so I was getting on to the 1930s. I was trying not to do this strictly chronologically, somewhat thematically, looking at the life of Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. As I explained yesterday night, he had a double-barrel surname, Spencer Churchill, though he chose to dispense with the first half of his double-barrel surname since he didn't wish to be so far down the alphabet. Anyway, there are many people who hold a candle for Churchill, owing to his stalwart opposition to appeasement. So what is appeasement? Well, Churchill himself put it this way: appeasement is feeding the crocodile in the hope that the crocodile will eat you last, which obviously presupposes that our proverbial crocodile has an insatiable appetite, will never stop, and so forth, and you yourself are not reptilian. So this was only in relation to the 1930s. So Churchill was obstinate in his opposition to appeasement. Appeasement of whom? He was an ardent appeaser of Italian fascism and various other forces, both before and after the Second World War. Only in relation to the Third Reich did Churchill say that reconciliation, to use perhaps a euphemism, would be it. But if we're going to use, what would the word be? Well, just a more damning or pejorative expression, that would be appeasement, because appeasement is a boo word for many people. So Churchill had travelled to Italy in the mid-1920s. Remember that Benito Mussolini had been appointed appointed president of the council in 1922. We often explain that as prime minister, but it wasn't. It's actually Presidente del Consiglio at the time. Anyway, Churchill had addressed a fascist rally. Now, the fascist party was a fairly popular party. Fascism wasn't seen as anathema as it is today. So in that oration, Churchill revealed that had he been Italian, he would have been amongst them, a member of the Fascisti. And Churchill also lauded Benito Amilcare Mussolini as a great lawgiver. Now, in fairness to Winston, at that time, Mussolini was seen as a modern-day Solon by many people, and it was nothing like as bad as he later became. So, a bit like Adolf Hitler, Mussolini was canny enough only to de-democratize an inch at a time, not to do it all at once. It's got to be a piecemeal establishment of a totalitarian state. Bear in mind, Mussolini was the one who invented the word totalitarian. He said everything within the state, nothing without out the state, and so forth. Although he didn't confiscate individual businesses private, there were actually large private businesses. He talked about the corporate state, or corporatism, and so forth, but he wasn't against corporations per se. I know people are trying to say, oh, it's socialist and blah, 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 which is largely bull. It's certainly more than tolerated capitalism, which is not a swipe at modern-day capitalism or conservatism, as I am a conservative myself, but we mustn't twist history to try and fit our modern beliefs, or just for the sake of vituperating our opponents. So because of current inter-party asperity, people sometimes misrepresent the past, seeing as that some sort of battlefield for contemporary political disputes. Anyway, Mussolini was fairly popular in Italy and abroad, and the United States government had a cordial relationship with him in particular. The US ambassador to Rome, he praised him to the skies, and this was going much beyond what one would expect out of mere diplomatic nicety. It just wasn't a case of cursity, it was genuine warmth. So many people considered communism to be the real threat, and indeed a mortal peril to liberty, and the communists were overt in their wish to spread their ideology all over the world by force, as they would see it to emancipate the proletariat, who were held in thraldom by the capitalist bourgeoisie, by plutocracy masquerading as democracy. So the insupportable oppression in the Soviet Union was something that was widely known about abroad, and the misdeeds of Mussolini pale into insignificance in comparison to the monstrous cruelty of the Soviet government, which was just super inhuman. Anyway, in October 1935, the Kingdom of Italy invaded Abyssinia. These days we call it Ethiopia. The League of Nations, that was the precursor of the United Nations, could have played a crucial role in preventing this or halting once it had begun. But Roy Jenkins, who penned a highly sympathetic biography of Churchill in 2001, he wrote that Churchill regarded the League as a namby-pamby organization. So Winston excoriated the Italians for the annexation of Abyssinia, which of course was inconsistent with his desire to build a coalition against fascism. So people in the United Kingdom and France had foreseen that another war against Germany was a significant possibility. They therefore had to make contingency plans, and who would be a crucial ally in this would be Italy. So they're trying to keep Italy as a potential ally, not to aggravate the Italians. If Italy's provoked, it'll go into the German camp. Ideally, Italy would be on the Franco-British side. If not, could at least be kept as neutral. So, and until the late 1930s, there was a serious chance that Italy might join the Entente Cordiale. So if Italy were not a co-belligerent, at least keep the Italians out of the war altogether. Remember, the Italian fleet was formidable, and the Royal Navy said this is a serious threat to us, so we'd rather have them as an ally than an enemy. I can't remember who said it. You know, you choose your enemies carefully, well, even more carefully than your friends. Now, we know that the Italian army wasn't up to much, and the Italian Air Force was tiny. They weren't so sure the Italian army was puny at the time, and Italian officers were not all poltroons, as has subsequently been portrayed. Indeed, it's a misportrayal. Anyway, but so about the invasion of Abyssinia, the Italians said that 50 years earlier, the Gauls and the Britons were invading African countries. What's changed? Well, I suppose the answer is the United Nations had changed. They all recognized other sovereign states, and invading a sovereign state was forbidden. Each sovereign state had to recognize the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of the others, and the Italians were in flagrant breach of this. Because of the Wal incident, which was several years earlier, had the Italians proclaimed war against Ethiopia forthwith, then that might have had a certain logic to it, but they know they'd waited several years. So forth was obviously using chemical weapons, using gas to kill the Abyssinians in huge numbers. Well, a bit like the Russian Federation today, they lied and lied and lied about it for months. A bit like, the Russian military in Syria. But when the evidence was absolutely undeniable, even finally Rome acknowledged the truth. Anyway, if the United Kingdom really wished to thwart German expansionism, then it would pay to keep Italy sweet. So that's why, Churchill was undermining his other policy. You might say, oh, well, it's consistent. Okay, you could put it that way. But it was certainly enfeebling the possible anti-Nazi coalition. Remember, the British Armed Forces were much feebler in the 1930s than they had been in 1914. Now, why was that? Partly because Churchill was one of those who in 1919 had pushed through the 10-year rule, which is to say that all spending decisions made in relation to His Britannic Majesty's forces were made on the presupposition that there would be no major war for a further 10 years. It was a time of severe austerity, and such retrenchment was healthy for public finances, which were on a sounder footing in the 1930s than they otherwise would have been. But such parsimony meant that the United Kingdom's armed forces were debilitated. They were feeble compared to those of Germany and the USSR by the late 1930s. Obviously, the Germans were spending money like billio in the first year of the Nazi government. So much money was given to the Wehrmacht that they didn't know what to spend it on. Anyway, we often hear that Winston was a day one abominator of Adolf Hitler. But in 1932, Churchill was in Germany researching a biography of his favourite subject, his ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough, because, of course, his ancestor fought the Battle of Blenheim, or Blindheim, as it is in German, a village in Bavaria. And that's why the family seat is Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire. And so remember, the Nazis were still in office at that time, and Winston requested to have luncheon with the leader of the National Socialists. So Hitler, he concurred, but he had to cancel at the last minute, so the two never met. But asking to have lunch with Hitler suggests that Churchill's principled opposition to the Nazis did not start quite so early as we are led to believe. Okay, Hitler wasn't even in government. It was far from blatant what Laos was to become. There are a lot of controversial politicians in the world, people who say loathsome things or express racist views, or who more than tolerate violence by their supporters. And usually people turn Nelson's eye to that, say, well, you got to take the rough with the smooth, or at least he's frank. Hello there, straight white British Protestant, or, you know, he shoots from the lip and he's not someone who goes in for chicanery, the sort of thing which is said to excuse Trump's incitements to violence or his frequent racial screeds. Let me see. So it's true that in politics people have to deal with people they detest. That's simply a fact of life. But Hitler was an opposition politician at the time. He wasn't the chancellor as he became the following year. And Churchill was a backbencher. He was not there representing His Majesty's government. Furthermore, in 1937, Churchill published a magazine article praising Hitler. Now, I can't remember the exact quotation. It is quite limited, but nonetheless. Now, Churchill, was he aware that Hitler was satanic by the mid-40s? Yes, he certainly was. We weren't that sure of it in the 1930s. Yes, they'd done some very bad things. They'd been the Night of the Long Knives and so on. But obviously, people overlooked far greater wrongdoings in the Soviet Union and elsewhere by that time. You know, the United Kingdom itself, well, a British army officer had ordered the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in India in April 1919, and scarcely a word said about it within a few years. So people often write about how horribly oppressive the Third Reich was. Now, it certainly was hideous. It dismantled German democracy within 18 months of the Third Reich being established. But in the 1930s, at that same time in the Soviet Union, the government was much more cruelly oppressive than the Third Reich. So millions of people had been killed by the Soviet government in the Soviet Union. Not many people abroad, but in the Soviet Union. And I mean millions, no exaggeration. And this was through execution, simply shooting them dead usually. This was through slave labor. Why is our image of the Soviet Union not being forced into a cattle truck, as it is with the Third Reich? Sent thousands of miles to Siberia or Kazakhstan, laboring where in Vorkuta, Karaganda, or elsewhere, you know, in these unheated carriages, people living in these rude huts, crawling with lice, total lack of sanitation or any medical care, being fed starvation rations, having to work extremely long hours doing heavy labor, subject to savage beatings from the guards, and so forth. And that's what it was like. The Soviets weren't deliberately ethnic cleansing people, George, that's the difference. Well, I'm not quite sure that's true, because let's say the Chechens or the Crimean Tatars, towards the end of the Second World War, they were rounded up, put in cattle trucks, and sent thousands of miles to the east. And many of them died in the process. I mean, a significant percentage of them died in the process. I'm not saying it's 50%, more like 10%. And they weren't allowed back to their homes for over 40 years, well after the danger had passed. The Second World War was long over. So that is ethnic cleansing, which is not killing all of them, or even half of them, but a serious number were killed. Or let's say the famine in Kazakhstan, which was entirely man-made at a time of rapid economic growth, when they were exporting food, and the Soviet government knew precisely what was going on. The government controlled everything. It was a totalitarian state. They had their informers everywhere, and they had their archives. At that time, in the 1930s, it was more of a surveillance state than anywhere else on the planet, and controlling who had what, who grew what food, how much food was grown, where it was moved hither and thither. So it's not like a famine in Ireland or India or anywhere else, where the government was rather laissez-faire, and that's one of the criticisms, was fairly hands-off. In the Soviet Union, it was completely hands-on, was entirely responsible for anything that happened, good or bad. Let's say in Kazakhstan, saying you can no longer be nomads, going to these itinerant people, taking their horses off them, saying you must stay here, live a sedentary lifestyle, giving them some seed and saying, this is not going to work. We've lived on the steppe or the tundra for millennia, and we know we'll get one season of crops out of this soil if we're lucky, and that's it. And of course, they're quite right. The reason they lived this lifestyle of constantly traveling is because they knew that the soil would not sustain a second crop, and indeed, so it proved. And the soil was exhausted, and they had nothing to eat by a second year, and they were given sort of minimal tools or nothing but housing with. And of course, it's extremely cold in Kazakhstan. You know, I was there when it was minus 28, and that's not the coldest by any means. So about 30% of the Kazakh population died in 3 years, about 30%. And I'm careful not to go with a particularly high estimate for that. And this is a time of reasonable harvests. But just because the state said, no, you can't have that. So trying to destroy their way of life and knowing that a huge number will be killed in the process, the government could reverse policy, could have provided food aid, but didn't. And they can't claim ignorance, and they can't say it's not their responsibility, because everything was in the government's purview, and the government arrogated to itself the right to control everything, and therefore be responsible for everything that happened. So they can't take credit for spreading literacy whilst denying the blame for so many people dying of starvation. So these were deliberately created famines there and in Ukraine and so on. Was it an ethnic thing? Was it an anti-Ukrainian thing? I don't think so particularly. The others say who was, because so many of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, so many of the clergy were killed, as in they were living repositories of Ukrainian identity and culture. And there were these blind minstrels who used to wander around the country, and the NKVD, like Народный Commissariat Внутренних дел, that's the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, they would arrest and torture these wandering blind poets and balladeers and kill them, again, because I suppose they carried Ukrainian culture with them. So to try and wipe that out. Just an exceptionally shameful and foul thing to do. Anyway, so this is not whataboutery, all right? Nazi crimes are not made acceptable by the fact that communist crimes were also committed. There's not a case that two wrongs make a right. Both wrongs are wrong. Neither of them is right. And neither of them was actually done against the other side, really. So the German government was not the most villainous government in Europe at the time. The Third Reich was certainly brutal, but the brutality of the USSR towards its own people was of a different order of magnitude. And there is moral equivalency of the two regimes, but up until 1939, which one was more hideous? It was certainly the Soviet Union. So why did the United Kingdom have some sort of moral obligation to defend dictatorial Poland against Germany, but not to defend it against the USSR? Why was the United Kingdom obliged to do that, but not obliged to defend democratic states such as Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, or Romania against the Soviet Union? It just doesn't make any sense. Have I read Hermann Göring's letter to Winston Churchill? No, I haven't, actually. You can fill me in on it later. So it seems to me that Winston Churchill never saw a war that he didn't like would cross a street to get into a fight. And so his first instinct was to get stuck in. So appeasers are execrated these days. But is it not possible that they were actuated by humanitarian motives? Many of them were men who'd fought gallantly in the First World War, so their fortitude should not be doubted. Moral courage as well as physical courage. These men can scarcely be dismissed as cowards. They had no wish to see a repeat performance of the butchery that they'd witnessed in the First World War. And so having a prejudice towards peace is laudable. We ought to lean that way. If you're not sure, opt for peace. If you believe we should fight, you should have a very, very convincing case indeed, morally, legally, but also that you're going to win. Not fighting just to show off or something like that, just for macho posturing. What if all these people are killed on both sides and you lose anyway? So, what else? So, who was Britain's foremost appeaser in the 1930s? It was Edward VIII, later known as the Duke of Windsor. So the Duke of Windsor, well, he was Prince of Wales until the 20th of January 1936. He was a close friend and confidant of Winston Churchill. Indeed, Winston is the only politician whom Edward VIII addressed by his Christian name. With all the others, it was Mr. Chamberlain or Mr. Baldwin and so forth. Now, Churchill was a passionate monarchist and a crashing snob, so he would forgive the royals well nigh all. And in 1936, Churchill was one of the few people in the establishment, probably the only Conservative member of Parliament, who said that Edward VIII ought to remain as king. And further than that, that Wallis Simpson should be allowed to become queen if the king married her. And this was despite the fact that it was well known that Edward VIII was deeply sympathetic towards National Socialism, and indeed was passing state secrets to Joachim Ribbentrop, who was Germany's ambassador at the court of St. James. Imagine if King Edward VIII had remained as monarch. What would have happened in 1939? He might have refused to declare war, and indeed he said that that's what he would do. There would have been a constitutional crisis. What are you going to do then? Even if war had been declared, he might have been passing secrets to the Third Reich all the time. Can you imagine putting the head of state on trial for treason? I mean, it's not been tried since 1649. So the 1930s divorce was highly unusual, much more so than it is today, when it's not a particularly controversial thing. Not many people think the worse of someone for being divorced, but in those days, it doesn't matter if you were sinned against as sinning. The injured party was still regarded as immoral for having dissolved their marriage. Back in the 30s, it was a lengthy, expensive, and exceptionally contentious thing to do. So traditionalists looked askance at this. Anyway, so Mrs. Simpson, she was about the soon-to-be twice divorced woman. Her intimate relationship with the king had begun whilst she was still married. And she had when the divorce came through, she was going to have 2 living ex-husbands. If she got divorced twice and they had both died, then she would have been, wouldn't have been so objectionable to most people for her to wed the king. But there were other problems with this. I mean, she was almost 40, she was childless. Was she capable of bringing forth children? That was questionable. She wasn't from a noble family, she was American. There were different people objected to different parts of this. Some people objected to all of it. But anyway, to countenance such a move was a highly unconservative thing to do. And indeed, granting of the title Queen was extraordinarily unconservative. So Churchill's attitude towards Mrs. Simpson could be called broad-minded, humane, progressive, understanding, and the rest of it. But by the standards of the 1930s, it was most assuredly not conservative. He was highly liberal in this regard. So when Edward VIII became Duke of Windsor during the Second World War, he continuously undermined the war effort, and Churchill did nothing about it. Anyone else would have been court-martialed for a fraction of what the Duke did. You know, he was a serving officer in the British Armed Forces, and he deserted his post. He didn't withdraw to the United Kingdom. In France, he went right down to the Spanish border, into Spain without permission, and blah, blah, blah. He was still frolicking with Axel Wenner-Gren, the Swedish multimillionaire, who was known to be more than sympathetic towards the Third Reich. Anyway, in the late 1930s, Churchill was exceptionally unpopular for agitating for a war against Germany. Now, a war against the Third Reich would surely lead to several millions of deaths. So you would need to have an exceptionally good reason to do that, to sacrifice the lives of so many people, especially when you had to be very unsure about the outcome. His urge to fight seemed to be without a moment's thought for preserving the British Empire, and without considering the Empire's ability to win that war. It's genuinely interesting that he doesn't seem to have considered how likely it is the British Empire would win it, and at what sort of cost. Okay, wars involve deaths, all right, ought to go without saying, and they involve deaths on both sides, not just on the other side, and they're not particularly bad because they're a different nationality. Even their government policies are wicked. There probably never was a war in which one side was 100% wrong in its motivation or justification, and the other was 100% right. Or did the conduct of the war as a sort of clean kill, killing an armed man in combat, all right? that's a fair cop. What if he's dropped his weapon running away? Can you still kill him? These days you can. I mean, planes do that. They don't care if that guy's armed or not. If he's asleep in his barracks, I suppose he is a fair cop. But there are other things. Well, there's a building with 10 enemy soldiers and 1 civilian. Do you destroy it or not? You probably would. What if it was 5 enemy soldiers and 5 enemy civilians? Would you destroy that building or not? You see, that's more dubious. Is that immoral? Possibly. But, so, and then there are things which are outright immoral, as in deliberately killing civilians, knowing them to be civilians with no enemy soldiers around. And so that's always going to happen on both sides. I mean, some sides are worse than others. But anyway, Churchill, he didn't seem to pay any heed to the fact that there was no popular stomach for the fight. There was a heartfelt desire for long-term peace, and that was morally right. Surely it's a praiseworthy thing to strive might and main to remain at peace. There was the renowned King and Country debate in the Oxford Union Society in February 1933. That's when these Oxford undergraduates had said that they would under no circumstances fight for king and country. Remember, the Great War for Civilization, the First World War, was supposedly all about king and country. And there was the Peace Pledge referendum. There was a League of Nations Union in the United Kingdom and other countries, an organisation of those who are committed to upholding the League of Nations and thinking that was the way to guarantee peace, collective security. If any state turns out to be aggressor, all the others will have sanctions against that country for a year. If that doesn't work, war. But anyway, this referendum organised by the League of Nations Union demonstrated beyond a penumbra of doubt that there was a widespread desire to remain at peace at any price. Despite all that, Winston persisted in calling for war. Now, you could say he was meddlesome, or you could say he was obstinate. And perhaps he was downright foolhardy, and indeed self-defeating, as he was so keen to preserve the British Empire. So Winston wished to maintain British paramountcy in certain regions of the globe. He also wanted to fight a war against a superpower which had evinced not the slightest desire to challenge British hegemony. So Winston was warned that fighting the Third Reich would deal a death blow to his beloved empire, even if the United Kingdom won, all right, which was a very big if at the time. And so it proved. This war spelt a finis to the British Empire, and the United Kingdom was over as a superpower forever. So we all know that the United Kingdom declared war in 1939, ostensibly to save the Polish Republic. What did Churchill agree to do about Poland in 1945? It was not to return Poland to its 1939 borders. Anybody could have told you that, and that this war could only redound to the advantage of the Soviet Union, which emerged in 1945 much stronger than it had been in 1939, even though perhaps 20 million of its people were killed. Its soldiers were hundreds of miles further west than they had been beforehand. It was lauded in many countries, and obviously its main potential enemy, the Third Reich, had been ground into the dust. And communism was regarded as a reasonable position in the United Kingdom and many other countries at the time. The Communist Party of Great Britain was only getting a small percentage of the vote, perhaps 2% of the vote, but large sections of the Labour Party considered it acceptable, even though they didn't quite agree with it. So should the United Kingdom have gone to war at all? Britain owed Poland nothing. Now, very few Britons bore the Poles any ill will. Why would they? Some Poles had been in the German army in the Second World War. Remember, Western Poland was part of Germany. Southern Poland was part of Austria-Hungary. But so they were conscripted into that. Józef Piłsudski, the leader of the Polish independence movement in the First World War, he indeed had deliberately supported Germany, saying the independence of Poland relies on the defeat of the Russian Empire, and Russia is the most oppressive of Poland's three masters after the third partition of Poland. He was right. But why should the UK stick its neck out for Poland? What on earth had Poland ever done for Britain? So the Poles didn't even request assistance from the UK. It was this impromptu guarantee from London. It was an unsolicited promise when the United Kingdom said in March 1939, if anybody takes an inch of your land, we'll go to war against them. So this made Warsaw even more stiff-necked in its parley with Berlin in the middle months of 1939. They were talking about how they were going to resolve the differences between them. Anyway, I don't know, many of the German demands were unreasonable. So the Third Reich was negotiating with Poland in the latter part of 1939. Remember, when they seized territory from Czechoslovakia, broken up Czechoslovakia, the Third Reich, they'd even given Teschen, this town on the Polish border, to Poland. So Poland had participated in this. Poland was a military dictatorship run by Ignacy Mosicki. So the Third Reich wanted a 400-meter wide corridor to connect the major portion of Germany with East Prussia. That's where Königsberg is. Is now part of the Russian Federation, known as Kaliningrad. There are virtually no ethnic Germans there. Named after Mikhail Kalinin, who was the Soviet head of state, after his death in 1946. Curiously, Stalin was actually not the head of state, right? He was the head of government. But Kalinin was completely unthreatening to him. That's why nobody's ever heard of him. So the Poles were entirely within their rights to refuse to grant the Germans some access there. Remember, the Polish corridor connecting the major portion of Poland, the Polish majority area, to the Baltic Sea, only existed because they took some German majority land, where Gdansk is, or Danzig as they used to call it, an area that was 80% or more ethnically German. But let me be crystal clear. The Third Reich caused the war and Poland did not. Right? It was unprovoked aggression on behalf of the Third Reich. The Polish Republic is not culpable for this war. I'm not implying that, so don't think there's any imputation of Polish aggression from what I've said. So Berlin was the aggressor, and they staged a fake attack on themselves, a false flag operation by so-called Poles. In fact, there were German concentration camp prisoners dressed up in Polish army uniform, shot dead near a near a radio station in Germany, very close to the Polish frontier. That supposedly provided casus belli. The Third Reich wanted Gdansk. They called it Danzig in German. It was supposedly run by the League of Nations, but effectively run by Poland. Okay, now it's true that Nazism was despicable. That doesn't prove that every single claim they made was unfair. If the Poles had made some concessions, maybe the Third Reich wouldn't have fought. Even if the Third Reich had attacked them, it would have provided greater moral clarity for what Poland was doing. If the United Kingdom really wished to be of assistance to the Poles before that declaration of war, the British Army could have dispatched some of its troops and stationed them on Polish soil with Poland's permission, but there was not a single soldier on Polish loam at the time. So anyway, that would have demonstrated to the Third Reich that the UK was sincere in its desire to assist Poland in defending itself. But Adolf Hitler simply assumed that the British guarantee to fight alongside Poland was so much hot air. He'd called Britain's bluff so many times before, and the German leadership just thought the Brits were somehow cowardly. We're all talk and no action. Anyway, we're so often told that the UK was morally obliged to fight against Nazism, as I've said. Why is it that no other country on earth was morally obliged to do so? Sweden, Switzerland, Portugal, Turkey, and so on. These countries remained neutral throughout the Second World War. There were others, like, say, Argentina declared war on the Third Reich at the last possible moment, and there were obviously lots of minor countries in South America or Asia who remained neutral throughout the war. What I'm saying, well, like Mongolia or Nepal or something, not much to do with them. It wasn't a great deal more to do with the UK. Anyway, so plenty of countries were neutral until they were attacked. Let's say Belgium, Luxembourg, they were neutral until they were attacked. But why is it the French and the British are the only ones who are under such an obligation to fight against the Third Reich? There's so much sanctimonious and sententious twaddle is talked about it, and that finds its way into pro-Churchill discourse. It's drivel. all right? So even if you think the UK's record on appeasement isn't spotless, it's still better than every single other country on earth. Every single one, bar none. Likewise, in taking Jewish refugees at this time, the kinder transport that the United Kingdom didn't do enough, okay, and you could argue that, but the UK's record is still better than every single other country on the globe. Thank you. You think I have a beautiful voice, but you know, something wrong with my throat. I had getting over a bit of laryngitis. Appears to be coming back. So please get me work as a voice actor because it's my instrument. I won't talk about my other instrument. Anyway, so I hear you say that the United Kingdom was obliged to go to war on account of the Holocaust. Now, no other country went to war because of the Shoah. Well, the UK didn't either, actually. It wasn't even planned when the war began. There was the Wannsee Conference of 1942, that house at Wannsee, that lake just outside Berlin. I've been there, actually. It still stands, that house. Now, it's true that prior to 1942, several thousand Jewish people had already been murdered by the Third Reich. It goes without saying that it was evil on a grand scale. Now, there's probably not been a war in which an atrocity hasn't been committed, and the atrocities were not absent in the Second World War, including in the opening stages. And now the Third Reich was not averagely bad in terms of crimes against humanity. It was egregiously bad. It was a quantum leap beyond what one would expect in an ordinary armed conflict. And I allow for atrocity propaganda. I realize the figures will be inflated or some things will be outright invented. Even taking that into account, there are enough things which are documented, which are just indisputable, which happened, massacres of civilians perpetrated by the Wehrmacht. Anyway, but none of that was apparent in 1939. No one predicted that the Third Reich was trying to annihilate the Jewish community. No one, no Jewish leader that I've heard of or anyone else, any Gentile leader, forecast that. 1/3 of the German Jewish community was still in Germany at the outbreak of war. Now, I know it was difficult, they had to pay for an exit visa and blah, blah, blah. Some of them were frail and elderly, but if you knew that remaining was a death sentence, you would get out no matter what, even illegally. So the Third Reich practiced racial discrimination by law, had done almost since its inception. And that is, of course, despicable. I don't want anyone to suffer racial discrimination. Many other countries enforced racial discrimination at the time by law, and that's wrong. That doesn't make it acceptable that the Third Reich was doing. It's shameful and nauseating wherever it happens. There were racist laws in South Africa at the time. It's true that full-blown apartheid wasn't introduced in 1948 in Zimbabwe, then called Rhodesia, in many of the southern states of the United States back then. So Nazi Germany was bad on racial issues, not uniquely so. This article is not, well, I'm not trying to whitewash what the Third Reich was doing. There was satanic wickedry on behalf of the Third Reich. Murderous it most certainly was. But let me get one thing clear. The war was not fought to prevent or to halt the Holocaust. It didn't actually stop it once it had commenced. The Nazis embarked on their hideous campaign of a mass slaughter of Jewish people, of gypsies, of homosexuals, of Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, Belarusians, Freemasons, Jehovah's Witnesses, the mentally and physically handicapped and so forth. These barbarities were underway in the Third Reich even before the World War began. Well, with regard to the mentally and physically disabled, the program T4, this operation was targeting what they called mental degenerates or physical degenerates, people who were seriously mentally handicapped. It couldn't be just sort of fairly low IQ, people with Down syndrome and so forth, or certain diseases like Huntington's chorea, people who are physically disabled. I don't mean just like missing your pinky. I mean like paralyzed from the neck down or something. That was done surreptitiously. And therefore the UK didn't know about it, and nobody cited that as a reason to go to war. Anyway, but we could say we do the same thing these days. We just do it to the babies before they're born, and we call it abortion, and liberal left people are usually very much in favour of that. Anyway, the war made the Holocaust a great deal easier to hide and it made it harder to escape, because obviously borders were sealed, and even if you got to a neutral country, they were chary about letting you in, or an allied country. Can we trust this person? Is this person really a Jewish refugee, or is he or she a Gentile pretending to be one as a secret agent? Or could a Jewish refugee be allowed to flee, but we're keeping your sister back in Germany, and you better act as a secret agent, sending us intelligence back, or we're going to kill her? I don't know if they ever threatened that thing in particular. So the war made Germany less susceptible to being sent to moral Coventry. Moral isolation for shameful behaviour, that might have forced Germany to at least water down its anti-Semitic policies. There are many incidences of genocide since 1945, was so often wrong that it's told that it's absolutely wrong to intervene in Iraq to save the Kurds from genocide, which most undoubtedly occurred in the 80s, in the 90s. And of course, ISIS was trying to do it more recently, and the Turkish army, I'm afraid to say, has got a very bad record against the Kurds. I'm not anti-Turkish in the least, been there, spent several months there, many Turks I like. Not saying that most Turkish soldiers are responsible for this, and I make allowances. I realise that bad things will be done in war, all right? In counterinsurgency, soldiers tend to behave fairly badly, but the Turkish army, I'm sorry to say, has on the whole behaved very badly towards Kurdish civilians. Anyway, we're often told that it was illegal and immoral to intervene in Kosovo to prevent massacres. Now, as I say, I realise that there will be some, okay, or perhaps I should use the passive voice, that some soldiers will be evil, of whichever army they are. There will a few psychopaths who will slip into the army, and they will do things, they will see a red rag. The question is, how frequently does it happen in this conflict? How large scale are these massacres? Do senior officers step in to discipline these men, to bring them before court-martials, or not? Do they ignore it, or do they even encourage it? Anyway, we're often told it's wrong. It was wrong to intervene in Rwanda, or we shouldn't have intervened at all in the very small way we did. How do I retain such information? Well, I've got 2 eyes and 2 ears, so my retention's always been reasonable. Some things I just find unutterably scintillating, therefore it's not difficult to commit them to memory. I'm a bit of an autistic savant when it comes to geopolitics. Anyhow, so paleoconservatives tend to favour continuity. They believe in staying out of foreign quarrels. We mustn't be entangled by overseas alliances and so forth. And we ought to respect national sovereignty, to uphold international law, and not to get involved into the internal disputes of other nation states. There was no British national interest at stake in Poland. Nobody suggested that. Britain was an oceanic power, not a continental power. It had no land frontier with Germany or indeed Poland. Lord Curzon, the Foreign Secretary, he'd once said that the Polish border was not worth the bones of a British grenadier. I think Bismarck had found that. I can't find the video on the Bablu Mia said that. On the what? Otto von Bismarck had said something similar about the eastern frontier of the Second Reich. So Poland was like Czechoslovakia, as Neville Chamberlain had said, a faraway country of which we know little. Well, it wasn't that far away, but it is true, as Poland had disappeared off the map for a century until 1918. By 1939, I think a lot of Britishers would be hard-pressed to locate it on the globe. And there they were fighting about Gdansk, a city that most Britons couldn't even spell. Eton interviews. Bablu, what do you mean, interviews with whom? Or how to do well as an interview trying to get into Eton? You can direct message me. You can write to me on Facebook. I'm George from Ireland. Obviously, what else am I? I'm on Twitter and Instagram, but appear to have at least temporarily lost access to Instagram. So the United Kingdom felt compelled to step into the Chaco War. No, it didn't, for the scholarship program. Interviews about how to perform in interviews. All right, well, I don't think I did a video specifically about that. I did one about interviews to get into public schools in the United Kingdom at the age of 13 or so. When I say public school, it's open to the public if you can pay. It's open to the public just like the Ritz. Although there are scholarships, could be up to 100%, but that's very rare. Take the Chaco War. I was saying early in the 1930s, Paraguay against Uruguay, Why did the UK not got involved there? The United Kingdom didn't stick a nose in there because Britannia had no interest one way or the other, had no dog in that fight. Checo, what does that even mean? Where is that? Paraguay? Bolivia? Who knows? Who cares? Sorry, hope that's not being callous towards them. Why should London suddenly feel that it was mandatory to take sides in this dispute? All right? I didn't, and why should it feel that it has some sort of duty to get stuck into this war between Poland and Germany? In the 19th century, it stayed out of these continental disputes from Waterloo until 1914, with I suppose one exception, the Crimean conflict, and that was really more about the Middle East. My son was chosen for it and has interviews and tests soon. I was just wondering if any advice on how to ace it. Hello, Babalu. Well, I might do a video about, what to do. You can obviously book online lessons with me. I do mock interviews with people. And I've got this article I've written about typical interview questions in this situation. Depends if he's 13 plus or 16 plus, which age he's trying to do it at. Typical questions and then model answers. But anyway, that's somewhat disrupting the flow of my oration. 16 plus. Okay, why don't you direct message me on what's it called, YouTube? So there is this bogus notion abroad that the United Kingdom fought to maintain democracy. Now, Nazism was most certainly anti-democratic. They're very open about that. But when did the Nazis ever provide the slightest indication that they had any wish to alter the United Kingdom's political system? They were not established to go against Bagehot or to undo Magna Carta or something like that. The United Kingdom had undemocratic allies. Need I mention the Soviet Union? Or trying to curry favour with authoritarian regimes like Portugal, I know it was neutral, and so on. Keeping some of the Vichy Vice in place, Admiral Darlan in Algeria. The colonies were run in an undemocratic fashion. Even Dominion, South Africa, all right, whites were allowed to vote, but the black majority, like 70% of the population, they were not allowed the franchise at the time. Please explain the title of this vlog. This is the conservative case against Churchill continued. I did over an hour yesterday about how Churchill was unconservative and conservative, certainly in the 20th century, broadly speaking, believe in democracy. Often though I say, well, only men should be allowed to vote, then women should be allowed to vote, and so forth. But there is much hot air about Britain supposedly fighting for democracy, which really is hogwash, because, as I say, it was on the side of some dictatorships, even the United States, that black people were effectively barred from voting in most southern states. Ben Perryman, I absolve you. Do you think Churchill is similar to Bojo in his political beliefs? Well, I suppose I do, insofar as they don't have any beliefs, only in themselves. It's really all about personal advancement. Now, Churchill was someone generously blessed with rhetorical gifts and so forth, and really was just bounding with energy, almost a fireball of creativity. So it was splendidly articulate and so forth. And his buoyant spirit really kept Britain's morale up in some very gloomy days. So Bojo has some of these same beliefs. But I don't think they really have bedrock beliefs. Is there some sort of principle that animates them? Is there some sort of consistency of belief? I don't think so. Even broadly in outlook, are there a certain area of policy that really animates them? It strikes me that there's none. They move here and there. Well, no, maybe I'm being unfair. I think Churchill was fascinated by foreign policy and militaria, but not really about domestic policy. That was just too humdrum, really, kitchen table politics, the nuts and bolts of welfare or taxation or things of that nature. My mother received a Churchill coin with her wedding rings back in 1978 Ireland. I've no idea, because it was an expensive thing. Yeah, Lee B, or is it Law B, as in, like, is it day or something? What's this sobriquet you've got for yourself there on YouTube? So, anyway, and the Britain did not go to war with the objective of introducing democracy to Germany, which had got rid of it in a piecemeal fashion 6 years earlier. Does democracy have to be delivered at gunpoint everywhere? I remember what Maximilian Robespierre Robespierre said that nobody welcomes our missionaries. Whose biography of Churchill do you rate the greatest? My goodness, there are hundreds to choose from. No exaggeration. I rather like the Roy Jenkins one, actually. You know, single volume ones, not multiple volume ones, not Martin Gilbert, which is perhaps the most compendious out there, but Martin Gilbert is still with us at the age of 80 and some odd years. So he's a Jewish chap. He appreciates the philo-Semite aspect of Churchill. Would you agree that Gladstone and Pitt the Younger are Britain's greatest prime ministers? Wow. What do we mean by greatest? Like successful or longest serving? Obviously, that was Robert Walpole, 21 years. I mean, Gladstone is obviously underappreciated these days, and partly because his party, now the Liberal Democrats, hasn't been the principal party of government for over a century. He did have some achievements. Pitt the Younger. I mean, obviously from today's perspective, he was wicked. I know he wanted to abolish slavery, didn't achieve it, didn't really prioritize that. I know he wanted Catholic emancipation, still a good thing. He certainly abridged civil liberties very considerably with regard to freedom of expression. They unduly broadened the definition of sedition to close down a lot of what we regard as permissible political discourse. This being the time of the Napoleonic Wars and the establishment being very shaky, thinking that revolution was in the offing. Indeed, there was the Cato Street conspiracy, well, a bit after his time. Well, he died in 1906, isn't that right? Died in office, if I got it right. Apart from Spencer Perceval, the only two to die in office. Is that correct? So, obviously, Pitt the Younger, I've got to hand it to him for even achieving office at such a tender age. I don't remember who wrote this doggerel. A sight to make all nations stand and stare, a kingdom entrusted unto a schoolboy's care. Looking at that very boyish-faced Chancellor of Austria, I forget the name, Sebastian Kurz. I put the same ditty up on Facebook. George Canning, I believe, died in office. Oh, forgive me, yes, he did. Yeah, after only 4 months in office, he died at Chiswick House, the very same room that Charles James Fox had died in. Obviously, Fox died in 1806, same year as his nemesis Pitt the Younger, and it was 1827 when Canning died. So I made a video about him outside his statue. A name is all but unknown these days, but there's still the Canning Club at Oxford that I've been to. And there was another Canning Club, I think, for Latin American people in London, because he promoted Latin American independence. Not that he cared two hoops for independence, really, but was simply to enfeeble Spain. So going back to London's decision to declare war on the Third Reich in 1939, it was a folly of the first magnitude. Britain knew that it was very ill-equipped to defeat the Third Reich, even with France as an ally. Remembering the French Empire was extant at the time. They had Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Mauritania, Mali, Senegal, I could get one, what we now call the Republic of Congo, Madagascar, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. They still got Guyana, still part of the French Republic, some islands in the Caribbean that they don't have now. But it had very outside metropolitan France, there was almost no industry. And obviously French industry was rather smaller than British industry. Anyway, for the first few months, France and Britannia, they did precious little to fight against the Third Reich. And they could not have mounted an offensive against Western Germany, since their strategy was almost entirely defensive. Towards the end of this time, de Gaulle launched this armoured strike into Western Germany, but was recalled after a few days. So they could have bombed the Third Reich, but they didn't. Obviously, the British factories were building aircraft like crazy, and they said, if we start bombing them, they will hit back, and then every day we are closing the gap on the Luftwaffe. The RAF is getting bigger and bigger. One thing I have to hand it to Britain for is when the decision was made to declare war, the UK went all out for it, saying, we don't give a damn about consumer goods, we'll put everything into the war effort. Whereas Germany had relatively low military spending when the war began and didn't really raise it to 1942, by which time it was too little too late. If the Germans had been completely committed to the war effort right from the outset, the outcome would probably have been different. So anyway, the first few months of the war in the West were known as the phony war, certainly by the American press. The French called it la drôle de guerre, the joke war, or the Germans quipped that the Western allies were fighting a Sitzkrieg, as in a sitting war. It's a skit on Blitzkrieg, as in lightning war. which is the German strategy, which relied chiefly on speed. And indeed, the rapidity of the German advance was something which stunned the Allies. It was really shock and awe. You ought to peruse Churchill and the Unnecessary War by Pat Buchanan, this arch-conservative commentator in the United States who served in the White House for, I believe, President Reagan and George Bush Sr. In his trenchant analysis, Pat Buchanan, he demolishes Churchill's case for war. It's a very closely argued tome, and I recommend it to you most warmly. Now, Winston himself said that the Second World War was the unnecessary war and wondered aloud why they were fighting. So Mr. Buchanan's views on a number of issues are toxic. He asperses non-white ethnicities, and there's an undertone of anti-Semitism to much of what he writes. But that doesn't mean that everything he says is nonsense, okay? So someone could be dead wrong on one issue, but spot on another. So give him a chance. It's very difficult to refute the thrust of his case. So the German occupation of Poland was most certainly monstrous. I don't think any person of any reasonable mindset would dispute that. Millions of Poles were killed, both Jewish and Gentile. About 6 million Polish people were killed in that occupation. Half of them were Gentile Poles. But nobody in 1939, in his worst nightmare, predicted violence on anything like that scale. All right, there'd be an occupation, civilians would be killed. It might be in the hundreds, it might be in the thousands, but it wasn't going to be in the millions, they didn't think. And obviously men were turned into slave laborers. I knew an elderly German woman, I don't know if she's still alive, and when she was a teenager, she'd had a Polish person as a slave living on a farm in Germany, having to sleep in a cow byre. So even if you think that the Allied case for war in 1939 was entirely warranted by the situation, there was a moral basis to it. In 1939, the Allies, they were not viable as a military force against the Third Reich. The UK had cut back its military spending so severely in the 1920s and 1930s. That was why rearmament in 1938, after the Munich Agreement, had barely brought the UK and France up to the level of German armament. So tight-fistedness had meant that British military technology lagged behind German technology in some respects, not quite a generation. Although the United Kingdom had just invented radar, but that was top secret. I was just walking past a place by Richmond Park today, where the chap who invented radar resided. It was news to me that that was where his domicile was. And incidentally, this is why there's this old wives' tale that eating carrots is good for your eyesight, because when British people, the Royal Air Force was able to detect German aircraft overhead in the Second World War, people were often saying, oh, well, that's because we eat so much carrots, we get vitamin B, is it? I don't recall which, as though people can see in the dark. Now, carrots are good for your eyesight, but only a tiny bit. If you eat loads of them, they don't make you see in the dark. But it was just this old wives' tale put about to try to hide the fact that radar was there. Very early in the war, the United Kingdom shared radar with the United States. I think it was Churchill who said this is the most precious cargo ever sent from the British Isles to America. Anyway, we know that the Allies won the war. They won the war in the end. They didn't know that in 1939. It was a very unsafe assumption. If I was a betting man, my money would be on the other side. Better carotene for eyes. Okay, thank you, Zach Grant Butler. Is that the active ingredient there? In carrots, right? That's not vitamin B or whatever? Anyway, why did the Allies win? They won because of Soviet blood and American gold. The United States provided the treasure. They are the deepest pockets. So should the UK have not joined the war? I think the United Kingdom ought to have remained aloof of the war. And yes, Hitler was a monster. There were a lot of monsters in the world. There are a lot of monsters in the world now. I don't think we should take them all on, okay? Kim Jong-un horrifically oppresses his people and is a threat to world peace. Should we go to war against North Korea? Now, I don't doubt that Western countries would prevail. How many people lives is the liberty of North Korea worth? Is it worth one life? Definitely. 100 lives? Yes. 10,000 lives? Probably. 100,000 lives? Not so sure. 1 million lives? I don't think so. 10 million lives? How? I mean, there are only like 25 million people there. Even if you are sure of the outcome. So that's that, and obviously then it obviously sets a dangerous precedent. We don't like your government. How bad does it have to be before invasion is warranted? And obviously he threatens his neighbors. Well, he certainly threatens, Japan, firing missiles over them. Threatens South Korea all the time. They've launched many unprovoked attacks on South Korea, sinking their ships and so forth, assassinating people abroad. And it's not as though that some of North Korea's foes haven't done bad things too. So is the moral difference that great? It's debatable. But anyway, so there was no reason to believe in 1939 that the United States would join the Allies or that the Soviet Union would do so. I remember that President Roosevelt was an avowed neutralist at the time. He swore that again and again. He was re-elected in 1940 on the pledge that he would keep the United States out of the war, all right? There was the America First Committee, which was zealously campaigning for American neutrality. It was a minor miracle that Roosevelt managed to achieve this derogation from the Neutrality Acts, persuade the United States Congress to pass that, allowing him to authorize the sale of arms to a belligerent in a war, in this case the United Kingdom, and to take over the security of Iceland. The United Kingdom had occupied that illegally against the wishes of the Icelandic people. How was that so different from what the Third Reich was doing? Iran also invaded by the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union, violating the very principle on which the whole war's moral basis was predicated. The USSR, of course, in 1939 had made an accommodation with the Third Reich. 23rd of August 1939 in Moscow, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, as in the surnames of the two foreign ministers. There was absolutely no reason to believe at that stage that the Germans would break this 10-year non-aggression pact. Why would they? Also, 10 years was credible. If they'd said 1,000 years, well, you might say that's ludicrous. Because it was working so well for them. The Soviets had held them against Poland. The Soviets let them set up a naval base in the extreme north, Basis Nord, was supplying them with tons of oil and foodstuffs and everything else. And the Soviets weren't asking for German communists to be released from concentration camps. So in the United States, neutrality was widely approved of. Some people were indeed anti-British. So, as I said, the America First Committee, they lobbied passionately for staying out of the war, not even selling arms to the United Kingdom. President Roosevelt received hundreds of letters each week demanding the United States stay out of the war, maintain the strictest neutrality. The notion the United Kingdom won the war is just ludicrously self-congratulatory and is really not borne out by even a cursory examination of the events. So let's look at the Second World War. On the 3rd of September 1939, the United Kingdom declared war on the Third Reich, and a message was sent to all ships of the Royal Navy: Winston is back. You can see one of those Winston Churchill biopics, very laudatory, and he hears that when he says, "And so he bloody well is." So he's so worked over as a subject for these films. Anyway, Churchill was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty. He was reprising the role he'd played in the First World War. But one of the mistakes he'd made in 1939 was not to prioritize anti-submarine warfare, which of course was Germany's main means of naval warfare in the First World War. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz had said that he needed, Erich Dönitz needed 1,000 U-boats to defeat the United Kingdom. He only had 50 when the war broke out. A huge strategic blunder on the part of the Third Reich, not to put everything into U-boats and forget about surface vessels. Their surface ships were not going to defeat the Royal Navy. So Churchill was one of those who advocated for intervention in Norway in April 1940. Norway was a neutral country, but Sweden produced lots of iron ore that was shipped to Germany, which is vital for their war economy. The Gulf of Bothnia abuts eastern Sweden, and in the winter it freezes solid. So the iron ore was sent by train out to Norway and shipped from there to the Third Reich. And so the idea was to interdict any shipments of iron ore. But admittedly, this is April, so it's all thawed. But it was for the forthcoming winter. They knew the war was going to last a very long time. One thing I have to hand it to Churchill about is in his early broadcast of the war, he said that This war will last at least 3 weeks. He was straight with people. This would not be brief. It would not be easy. It would be paved with misery and agony every step of the way. And these days, politicians don't sort of face up to how difficult it's going to be. They're not straight with the public about the true cost and extent of the war, how lengthy it will be. So anyway, Churchill in 1940 had even called for the invasion of a neutral country. That's to say the Kingdom of Norway, which had been very friendly with the United Kingdom and whose crown prince was indeed a first cousin of George VI. The whole principle on which the Allied war was based was that of upholding national sovereignty. How can you be in breach of this principle which predicates your case for war? So how on earth could the Allies commit such an act of unwarranted aggression? In fact, the Third Reich beat the Allies to it and invaded Norway, otherwise it would expose the Allies as complete hypocrites. The Royal Navy didn't cover itself in glory in Norway. It did at least sink a few German capital ships. The only large German naval vessels left at the time were Gneisenau and Scharnhorst. But who was in charge of the senior service at the time? It was a certain W.S. Churchill. Yet he did not carry the can for his underperformance. Perhaps he ought to have been dismissed or resigned. There were several other times that the Allies invaded neutral lands. I mean, I already pointed out Iceland, Iran. You might say the situation was force majeure. Winston, as he said in his VEDA broadcast, he gave very serious consideration to invading Southern Ireland. We're neutral at the time, that's what most of us wanted. Anyway, in May 1940, the Norway debates took place in the House of Commons. The Prime Minister back then was Neville Chamberlain, a Conservative. So the lanky and snaggle-toothed, rather auntie-ish figure, he was barracked for the dismal performance of the British Army in Norway, and it appeared that Chamberlain had lost the confidence of the House. So if this sharp-toothed Brummie was going to go, then who should replace him? So many favoured the Earl of Halifax. Lord Halifax was an erstwhile Viceroy of India and a Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, as in the intellectual Aristos, as a bit like being part of l'Académie Française. Now, Lord Halifax had impeccable establishment credentials, and he was a Conservative in the fullest sense of the word. He was a safe pair of hands, despite not even having a right hand. He wore a glove with a sort of dummy hand there, or tried to keep his right hand behind his back to conceal the fact that he was born with only one hand. Anyway, most Tories favoured the Earl, but the Yorkshire peer didn't get it. A minority of Tories and most of the Labour Party favoured Winston, even though he'd been a bit of a hate figure for the Labour movement, but they wanted him for sheer pugnacity. In the end, the Holy Fox, as the Lord Halifax he was known, didn't become Prime Minister, so he could carry on his fox hunting and is attending high Anglican worship, hence the Churchill family's nickname for him, the Holy Fox. So it was the 10th of May, incidentally the anniversary of the Indian Mutiny, that Churchill was invited by King George VI to kiss hands. And that's what they do when they become Prime Minister. There's no oath, there's no signing a document, they kiss hands. So Churchill became First Lord of the Treasury. When Winston was Prime Minister, the Battle of France was in full swing. So he must bear responsibility for the British Expeditionary Force's disastrous performance in France. It was defeated, as he himself openly acknowledged in speeches in Parliament and on the radio. So the BEF had to flee, and Churchill was eager to dispatch the entire Royal Air Force to France, but he was restrained from doing so. If he'd done so, it might have been curtains for the RAF and therefore the UK. So he was rash, he was headstrong. He really lacked judgment, which is why he made so many injudicious decisions. As I say, this is not circumspect as a Conservative is supposed to be. He was too much of a gambler, playing for very high odds. And he even used that analogy himself about deliberately exposing himself to fire when he was fighting on the northwest frontier of India. Anyway, so where were we? Going for well over an hour, but I feel I should wrap up soon because this has just been going on so long and it's too protracted. Who's going to listen all the way through to my exceedingly prolix oration? Anyway, to stand even an outside chance of winning the war, the United Kingdom was obliged to invoke the Defence of the Realm Act, or DORA, to give it its acronym, which had been passed in the Great War. And this meant, hello there, Libby, I will do what? Anyway, it was a very severe abridgment of civil liberty. The freedom of the press was curtailed in a most serious fashion. Habeas corpus was suspended. That's do you have a body, as in the law whereby someone must not be deprived of liberty without good reason. You should only be sent to prison if you're proved guilty of a crime. You can be remanded in custody whilst awaiting trial, but trials must be reasonably speedy. Justice delayed is justice denied. There must be a prima facie case for you to be remanded and so forth. You could listen to me all the way through. I'm very interesting. Thank you so much. Well, I'm pleased to hear that I'm intriguing. So clean the wax out of your ears. So I could go on all night, but need to wind up. It's also slightly wearing on my throat. So rationing was introduced. You couldn't trade as you wished to do so. Some property was sequestrated and so forth. People were conscripted into the armed forces. There were controls on currency transactions. People couldn't buy cameras, all road signs and railway signs were taken down. Therefore, if you were an enemy agent, you didn't know where you were. You had to ask directions or open a map, which is going to attract attention and comment. People would report you to the police. But all these measures were usurpations of personal liberty, which were necessitated by the war. None of these measures would have been needed had it not been for this entirely discretionary war. Okay, there are many oppressors in the world. Are we going to go to war against Turkmenistan? I don't think so. Or, is Assad so bad that we should go to war there? Do you believe it would have been possible to avoid the war with Germany? Yes, I do actually. Was Hitler not likely to invade Britain or France? I don't think he was likely to invade France. I don't see any chance he's going to invade Britain. I mean, I have never seen the slightest evidence that Hitler or anyone in Germany, anyone in 1939, had any intention of attacking the United Kingdom or any portion of the British Empire whatsoever. Am I wrong? I could be. Provide me some evidence. Maybe there were a few who said that, but if there is, I don't know about it. I think if there were any at all, I suspect it was very few and quite low ranking. All right. All sorts of people might say, we want to attack your country, whatever. But if you go and declare war on them, that's it. I'm absolutely correct. Thank you, Zach Grant Butler. Okay, so Hitler was kind of very open about it in his book, Mein Kampf. We must stop the perpetual German march to the south and west and turn our eyes to the east, principally towards Russia and the border states subject to her. Now, I know Hitler was an exceptionally mendacious person, but what he said in Mein Kampf is more or less what he did. Now, in fairness, they didn't know that in 1939, that he largely stuck to it. But anyway, events prove that was the case. The possibility of war is not as bad as the certainty of a war. What I would do is arm to the teeth and stay neutral, which would cost a fraction of what actually fighting the war is. So yes, the Third Reich in 1939 was very bad. They're very bad regimes now. We don't go to war against them. Are we obliged to get involved in Syria? Civilians have been killed in a huge scale there. There have been chemical attacks by President Assad's forces. Am I wrong? Is it the other side? All right. If it is ISIS or the Al-Nusra Front, should we send ground troops against them? Well, we're not doing it, so maybe we shouldn't. I mean, the United States is not doing so. The Republic of Ireland, we don't get involved in these things because we don't have the capability to. A bit like the United Kingdom in 1939, did not have the military strength to defeat the Third Reich. The Chiefs of Imperial General Staff had produced a memorandum in 1935 saying that, the UK could not defeat Germany and said we must stress the importance of political action to avoid war. Certainly couldn't risk a war against both Nippon and Germany at the same time. Anyway, in July 1940, Churchill issued an ultimatum to be delivered to the French fleet anchored at Mers-el-Kébir, so they lay at peace. We don't have military in Ireland peacekeeping missions, all really. We've got 8,000 soldiers in the Irish Defence Forces, so very small, only 8 vessels in our Navy. Boats, I think we could say, rather than ships. Okay, we're not a major expeditionary force. It's also good because we keep spending down, but that's that. I mean, I don't want to be militarist. So do we have an army worth a name? If we're going to have an army which is very puny, not wishing disrespect to the members of it, should we have one at all? Costa Rica does one without one. Got to the stage where the IRA might have been better equipped than our army. Anyway, so the French were offered a number of options. They were there off the coast of their Algerian colony. they could, within a couple of hours, come over to the Allied side. There was still already a free French navy fighting for the liberty of France with Charles de Gaulle as their head. Indeed, I know where the headquarters of the Free French Navy was, in London. They could agree to be interned in the United States, then a neutral country spend the remainder of the war there. Their vessels also interned. They could scuttle their ships, and if they didn't reply within 2 hours, then fire would be opened. I'm not sure the Royal Navy actually said that bit. We will open fire if you don't answer. Anyway, the French admiral, it was Darlan, did not respond by the deadline, and therefore the Royal Navy launched this unprovoked attack on the French Navy, a fusillade. So it was a most horrific bombardment. Over 1,300 French sailors were killed that afternoon, some of them falling into the sea where oil was burning, and they were just boiled alive. So not a single British seaman was killed. Well, the UK could at least take comfort from that. From a British perspective, it was a resounding success. Now, victory is not the apt word of it, but okay, once the British bombardment had begun, and presumably the French returned fire, but it was such a overwhelming and such a devastating attack. Not many French shells were fired. But many around the world regarded this as a dastardly attack on a neutral country. Winston argued that the French fleet could have been commandeered by the German Kriegsmarine, and it represented a mortal peril. Anyway, but this order was of dubious legality and morality, and the French became very hostile. As a result, they could have been neutral. It put the Free French in a very invidious position. How can you take the side of perfidious Albion, who launched this shameful, cowardly and treacherous attack on our peaceable sailors, slaughtered 1,300 of your compatriots? Churchill liked to think of himself as Nelson at Copenhagen. Ireland is a member of the EU Nordic battle group and faces down Russia along the EU northern border with them. So we've got, but wait a second, so we have troops in Sweden, do we? But Sweden, or Finland, yeah, Finland has a border with Russia. Norway's not an EU country, but it's a NATO country. So I know in the Republic of Ireland we've got this notion of neutrality, but really it's a pleasing fiction. Anyway, so remember Admiral Lord Nelson at Copenhagen, he had attacked the Danish fleet when Denmark was a neutral nation, because there was a chance that the Danes might join Britain's nemesis, France. Obviously, Denmark is an independent country, is entitled to make friends whoever they want, to be an ally of the French or not. Norway is in the Nordic BG as well, battle group, okay. So it's not an EU thing then. I didn't know all that. But there we go. So what else can I say about Churchill and all these people? Was it so morally different from Pearl Harbor? Okay, there was no declaration of war over Mers-el-Kébir. And Pearl Harbor, people often think is the most shameful and abominable attack. It's just so immoral whilst parleying about peace to conceive this attack. Anyway, remember that the US fleet was a knife pointing at the throat of Japan. Well, it's more or less Britain's argument towards the French fleet in 1940. But anyway, in 1941, Winston made 2 public offers to the Irish government to hand over Northern Ireland. He sent a message to the Taoiseach, that's the Prime Minister of Southern Ireland. You could say that. Remember, the Treaty of 1921 says Southern Ireland. Collins put his name to that. I know some other Irish people go apoplectic if I say Southern Ireland. I know the Republic of Ireland is obviously the term now, but I'm trying to distinguish it from the 6 counties. So Churchill's telegram said, "A nation once again, now or never." He's obviously quoting Thomas Davis's nationalist ditty. So Eamon de Valera turned Churchill down flat. Churchill was willing to expel Northern Ireland from the United Kingdom and hand it over to the Irish state. And the great majority of people in Northern Ireland did not wish to join Southern Ireland. They wanted to stay within the UK. Now, you might not agree with the Unionist viewpoint, but surely you can perceive that Winston was selling out the Unionists. He was selling them down the Swanee. Why was he betraying them? Because of this avoidable war. A British Conservative believes in the Union. Honey and lemon for my throat, thank you. Okay, did my granny ever boil Nash's red lemonade for you? No, she didn't actually, curiously. So at the outbreak of the war, the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, James Craig, had pledged that his devolved administration would do everything in its power to assist the war effort. Lord Craigavon had said, "We are the king's men." Yet Churchill was willing to break up the UK and hand these half a dozen counties over to a Republican in the shape of de Valera. I know de Valera didn't declare a republic. It's obviously a few years later after he left office that actually Fine Gael government, ironically, proclaimed the republic. But de Valera was right not to trust Winston and thought that the UK would lose the war, and of course that was a reasonable prognostication at the time in view of the circumstances which appeared to be dismal for the UK. The British armed forces were not even very successful during the war. Winston Churchill lamented that until the Battle of El Alamein in 1941, there was never a victory. And he's saying, I can't get the victories, that his men showed less fortitude and less motivation than their Axis foes. Anyway, where were we? So then why was El Alamein won? Partly because of Commonwealth troops, soldiers from India, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, and so forth, and other fights, soldiers from Zimbabwe, Uganda, Jamaica, and so on, fighting on the side of the empire, not sufficiently appreciated afterwards, sometimes treated very rudely if they tried to immigrate to the UK. So there's this pernicious myth that Britain fought alone during the war, or even for any section of the war. That was never true. Is it fair to say there's a cult of personality around Churchill? Indeed there is, okay, and he needs to be taken down off his pedestal. Not that he's all bad, and he certainly had his accomplishments. The Americans did much of the fighting, but 75% of the German casualties were sustained on the Eastern Front, inflicted largely by the Soviet Union, or some of the, say, Polish Home Army and so forth. The Soviets did the great bulk of the fighting. This awkward fact is conveniently overlooked by this self-serving British narrative of the World War and this claim that the British people were valiant. This self-flattery is at the core of this dishonest pro-Churchill propaganda. So away from this ludicrous and deceitful Churchillian myth, enough of that pro-Churchill publicity. So Churchill had a very good idea that the Katyn massacre in Poland had been perpetrated by the NKVD, that's the Soviet secret police. However, he chose to overlook it for reasons of state. And the Red Cross, a completely neutral organization, arrived at the conclusion that the Soviets had done it. For decades, the Soviet government lied and lied and lied about it until 1989, finally acknowledging that, yeah, they did it. 20,000 Polish prisoners of war murdered. They weren't trying to escape. They didn't try to attack their guards. They didn't die through neglect or illness or malnutrition, deliberately shot dead when Poland was completely defeated already. And I'm afraid to say that Moscow's policy is exactly the same. Tell the most barefaced, brazen lies, non-stop for years, pinning it on the other guy. The Battle of Stalingrad changed everything. If Germany won the battle, it would have been a very different story. Well, good question. I mean, I don't think that would necessarily have sealed the victory. It would have helped them a lot. It would be a big psychological blow. Hitler said the three holy cities of Bolshevism, Leningrad, named after Lenin, where the Bolshevik Revolution began, the former capital, Moscow, which really was the capital, and then Stalingrad, partly because Stalin's name was on it, supposedly the turning point of the Russian Civil War, according to Stalin's version of events. Not really, but he was a commander there, so he had his name put on the city. Also, it was the gateway to the south. It sat astride the river Volga, which is a major route for traffic, things transported by ship, and all the rest of it. Had they got there, well, they might have been able to get to the Baku oil. A bit before this, Hitler had a cake made for himself in the shape of the Black Sea, not the Black Sea, sorry, the Caspian Sea, thinking he's going to get down there. And then, what's his name? Stalin addressed the oil minister and said, okay, you have got to prevent oil falling into the hands of the Germans. If a ton of oil falls into the hands of the Germans, you'll be shot. If on the other hand, you destroy the oil facilities in Baku and the Germans do not get there, you will also be shot. But this man managed to get it right. I wonder if you give him plenipotentiary powers. All right, I must have the power to do anything, to sack anyone, send anyone to the gulag who doesn't shape up. So let me see. So in 1941, shortly after they invaded, astonishingly, the Soviets had the temerity to raise the future of Poland after the war could be guaranteed some of the Polish land we stole off them in 1939, obviously in cahoots with the Third Reich. And Churchill signed away Polish soil without consulting a single Pole. This is a cause of great resentment in Poland to this day. The issue separates, and it's not hard to understand why. So he's regarded as a gangster by many Poles. So it's astonishing to think that the Soviets were raising this issue in the autumn of 1941, when you might have considered that the Soviets had more urgent issues to contend with the Wehrmacht racing towards Moscow. But why did Churchill even entertain the idea of granting the Soviets this Polish loan? Well, I mean, the USSR was fighting for its very life. They scarcely needed an incentive to cooperate with the British. So if he's against appeasement, well, this is a funny way of being against appeasement. So talking about French Algeria, it was seized by the Allies, and the Allies agreed that the Vichy governor, as in the guide collaborated with Germany, Admiral Darlan, could remain on as governor. He kept his post. So much for principled anti-fascism. But anyway, so Darlan turned his coat, so all was absolved. It begged the question, what about Mussolini? If Mussolini was willing to be neutral or change sides, would he be allowed to stay as Prime Minister of Italy? And there was a back channel to Mussolini. We don't know exactly the content of that. I suppose it's probably still sealed away in the UK's National Archives for a century at Kew. But anyway, they say that Mussolini was looking for a strikingly similar deal to preserve his own position. But anyway, this secret negotiation didn't bear fruit. But we do know right at the end of the war, Winston was very eager that Mussolini be summarily executed upon capture, because dead men tell no tales. And he was indeed taken prisoner by Italian communist partisans who shot him immediately, because supposedly there was some secret negotiation which actually didn't come to fruition. So Churchill, he was an unreconstructed imperialist. You might think it's a splendid thing, but as he was warned, you can have an empire or you can have a war. You can't have both. Bit like Bojo, he wanted to have his cake and eat it. So even if the United Kingdom won the war, and as I said, it was very dubious at the outset, the United Kingdom would emerge from that war hugely enfeebled, and the Soviets hugely strengthened, as indeed they were, or especially they remained neutral, and saw the Western democracies and the Third Reich engaged in a slogging match and fight each other to exhaustion. But Churchill said in 1942, when he was trying to face down renewed unrest in India, I did not become the King's First Minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. But that's precisely what he did. The disturbances in India were so severe, he was obliged to dispatch the Labour MP Stafford Cripps to India, the desiccated calculating machine, as Churchill dubbed him. So Cripps, he had an amicable relationship with the Congress Party in India, and the Cripps mission resulted in the United Kingdom acknowledging that it would grant independence to India as soon as practicable after the close of the war. India was the keystone of the British Empire. Once that was removed, it was really a matter of time before all the rest collapsed. And it obviously set a precedent. You may think that the empire was grossly immoral, and that independence was a many splendid thing for the colonies. But even if it was wicked, Churchill did not believe that. Right? His self-appointed mission in life was to preserve the British Empire, and in that it signally failed. Everyone told him that if the war came, the empire would end, and indeed it did, but he pressed on regardless. Some people say that was the right choice. Anyway, Bengal, that eastern province of India, part of it's now Bangladesh, suffered a horrendous famine in 1942, a very large-scale one. So Churchill was kept apprised of the situation. Even though he was fully informed, he never lifted a finger to assist the Indians to dispatch food aid. In the United Kingdom, nobody starved, not a single person. You would have enough to eat, you'd never waste a morsel. But millions of people were malnourished in India at the time, and there's a lot of poverty there anyway, but it became really severe. So not all deaths could have been prevented, but hundreds of thousands certainly could have been saved. How many died of hunger in the Bengal famine? Was it 2 million? Was it up to 4 million? I don't know, but even going for the low figure of that, it is just unbelievably ghastly. And Churchill did nothing to alleviate the situation. And it's an issue which separates to this day, which causes huge fury and pain in India even now. So that wasn't very humane, that wasn't honourable of him, was it? In the run-up to D-Day, Churchill had a bright idea. Why not use England's oldest ally, Portugal? Portugal was then a neutral country run by this ultra-conservative dictator, Salazar, and the British troops would land in Portugal, probably have to invade it. Salazar wasn't going to assist. He was sympathetic towards the Axis. The British would then have to fight their way across Spain, the most mountainous country in Europe, and all the way to southern France, fight their way across the Pyrenees and all the way through France. It was an utterly imbecilic plan. What moron could have come up with this? A huge amount of staff time was wasted on contingency planning for this harebrained, self-indulgent scheme, which never came off, thankfully. But ever the glory boy, Churchill was eager that he should land on the beaches of Normandy at D-Day, but Eisenhower didn't want him there. Churchill said, well, I know you're commanding some British troops as well, but you have no right to dictate the complement of one of His Majesty's ships. So Eisenhower had to get King George VI to order Churchill not to go. So anyway, it'll be going on for 90 minutes. I've really got to end it because I could be here for hours, and my voice is slightly going. It's just so long. Who could possibly concentrate for so long? So please follow me on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, George from Ireland. Donate to me on Patreon or PayPal. I teach lessons. I know a thing or two about history, as you might have noticed. Philology, English literature, English as a foreign language, French, religious studies, politics and government. I tutor people for 11 plus exams or scholarships, 13 plus, GCSE, A-level, international baccalaureate. I help people with law degrees. I got a law degree as well. Thank you. I should look after myself. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Book me as a tour guide in London. You can direct message me. I translate from various languages into English, French, Spanish, Italian, German, Russian, and Romanian. Okay, good night, evening all.